So let's listen for God's word to us from the Gospel of Matthew. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became bright as light. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will set up 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my Son, the Beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell on the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they raised their eyes, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. This is quite some event. Jesus is transfigured on a mountaintop. We are told that it means his face shone like the sun, his clothes became bright as light. Moses and Elijah, the 2 most prominent pillars of the historic faith, appear, converse with Jesus, and then just as strangely disappear. Peter, James, and John, kind of the executive committee of the 12, so to speak, are present. Peter is clearly perplexed, but at least tries to respond, while James and John, well, they just remain silent. But we know all 3 are in awe. Right over the top of Peter's words, God speaks out loud, but mainly repeats what God had previously said at Jesus' baptism. Nothing new there. Then it was over. Jesus tells them, at least for now, to say nothing about what has happened. We may need some help to know what to make of this mountaintop experience. Knowing how to understand how the story functions in the world of the 1st century gospel when it was written, and importantly, how that might connect to us today. With respect to the historic setting, we know that each of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written well after the death of Jesus and with somewhat different audiences in mind. Matthew likely wrote around 80 years after the death of Jesus. This would have been a time when the church experienced conflict both internally and with the outside world. As part of the original audience, many scholars think Matthew's church was a Pharisaic synagogue, meaning it would have been made up primarily of Jewish converts to Christianity. Members would have believed that Jesus was God's eschatological or final rabbi, bringing the transition from the broken present age to the realm of God, the new age and the new world. They may well have expected him to return shortly, maybe even in their lifetimes. Of course, this synagogue would have been in direct conflict and created a great deal of tension with the traditional Pharisaic synagogues holding on to the law and Moses. Now, at the same time, there's a growing number of Gentile converts to this new Christian faith, creating some internal tension as well. Within Matthew's refocused synagogue, members of the community were evidently in tension regarding the degree to which the church at large should require the growing body of Gentile converts to adopt Jewish practices like theirs. Now, to add to these tensions, internal to the church. There's the externally, they are under the occupation of the Romans. How are they as Christians to relate to the Roman Empire and the imperial rulers? How are they to respond to the edict that they are to worship Caesar as their God? A lot of tension going on. I think we can actually relate fairly well to these tensions in our own day. We can describe both the internal and external tensions for the church over time in our church today. Perhaps this type of tension is what Charlotte Elliott had in mind when back in the 1830s, she wrote the words to the hymn, which we will sing later, Just As I Am. When we do that, I encourage you to look at verse 3. Just as I am, though tossed about with many a conflict and many a doubt, fighting and fears within and without. We can relate to these tensions. Matthew writes his gospel in part because some of the congregation are losing confidence in the coming of the realm, drifting away perhaps. Jesus has not yet returned as they perhaps expected, so they are drifting away. Matthew shapes the narrative of the gospel to encourage all to remain faithful in the midst of their moment in history. This is the context into which Matthew offers the story of the Transfiguration. He offers it as words of assurance, something beyond the healing and the miracles and the parables that Jesus has been saying and performing. Here is your definitive proof, he says. In the setting, only 3 people are present, Peter, James, and John. Yet Matthew intends the message for the whole community, both then and now. 6 days later, that being 6 days after foretelling his death, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John and leads them up a high mountain by themselves. Early readers of Matthew's gospel probably heard the parallels to Moses and Elijah stories. They know how much the older Exodus story of Moses means. Leaving Aaron behind along with 70 elders, Moses took Joshua with him up the mountain, where after 6 days, like the 6 days of creation, on the 7th day, the glory of God burned on the mountaintop, and God spoke to Moses in that place, giving Moses the words of the covenant with God's people. Maybe they also recall the similar echoes of the account of Elijah's mountaintop encounter with God. After sharing the spirit of prophecy with Elijah, his understudy, a chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the 2 of them, and Elijah ascended in a whirlwind into the heaven. Elijah, the understudy, kept watching and crying, "Father, Father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." But when he could no longer see him, he grasped his own clothes and tore them to pieces. This dramatic, powerful scene feeds the prophetic hope of Elijah's return, since he did not die in a typical way. Elijah's return is actually promised in Malachi, and the expectation of which is acknowledged to or alluded to in Matthew as well. So the Transfiguration emerges from a stream of traditional expectations and expecting the return of the great prophets Moses and Elijah as harbingering of a divine revolution. Their presence marks Jesus as their heir, their collaborator, their replacement in his holy work. Events of the Transfiguration unfold into their hearing so that they can see Jesus is the new Moses. Now they can see Jesus as the one who leads and empowers the people of God. When Moses and Elijah appear on the mountain of transfiguration with Jesus, these echoes from long ago resonate in the ears of the disciples and we as readers. Jesus and his followers are new players in the old story of God's encounter with God's people. And if the presence of Moses and Elijah is insufficient proof of Jesus' call, then God's voice settles the matter entirely in that verse 5. The voice from heaven, just as at Jesus' baptism, confirms again Jesus' divine identity and righteous character, but now adds a command to listen to him, meaning to obey him. Nothing less than Jesus' identity and Israel's hope of the resurrection glory is unveiled in this moment. For in the resurrection, the righteous one will shine like the sun. The disciples, their vision on the mountain is a confirmation of Jesus' identity and a preview of the glorious form of life that will characterize life in the kingdom of heaven. Interestingly, Jesus' altered appearance, along with the appearance of the patriarchs of the faith, does not send the disciples charging immediately back down the mountain in pure fear. I think that would have been my path at that point. Instead, Peter offers to build shelters. Maybe he's being practical, anticipating a lengthy meeting and a need for shelter. Maybe he wants to capture the moment for the future in the best way of his Jewish traditions. We simply don't know. What we do know is that he is interrupted by the voice of God. The voice drives the disciples prostrate to the ground. Always the appropriate posture before God in the Old Testament. No doubt the disciples put this experience together with Jesus' own earlier warning of his suffering and death to come. And there's little wonder that they overcome with fear. Jesus comes to his prostrate and fear-filled followers, as he will one other time in Matthew following the resurrection, and he touches them, just as he touched the diseased and the dead. He touches the disciples and commands them to rise and not be afraid. The disciples now see Jesus alone with them. They see only their leader back in his normal state. When it's all over, what are the disciples to do with this experience? Moses and Elijah are gone. The voice is quiet. Jesus' face and clothing have returned to normal. The disciples are left in holy awe. But all that is left is their normal human Jesus. Whatever signs and symbols meant, the disciples are once again with their Lord, their teacher, their human friend. This is perhaps one of the signature characteristics of Matthew. Jesus, the one whose clothes and face shone like the sun, the one who talks to Moses and Elijah, the one whom the very heavens proclaim as God's beloved Son, will not leave them. There he is. He is standing there with them. He suggests they start back down the mountain. I'm sure the question of how they are to share this mind-blowing experience with their fellow disciples is running through their minds. Signs like simple miracles and healings and parables have been difficult enough. Jesus has often had to explain them to the disciples. But this transfiguration, even if the disciples have a grasp of the transfiguration's meaning, as Matthew suggests, how could anyone interpret this to mean that he, God's Son, was prepared to face suffering and death for them? I'd hypothesize they must have been really relieved when Jesus commands them not to share their vision of his divine sonship in the transfiguration until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead, which would then make God's judgment and the meaning of the transformation clear. Ultimately, for Matthew and his community, this interlude in the telling of the story of Jesus, this transfiguration event, confirms Jesus' identity as the righteous Son of God, even as it signals hope for Jesus' followers of the glorious risen life to come, a life without fear and with Jesus. Matthew will continue his story of the life of Jesus, but we are now assured of who this really is. Well, this story of the Transfiguration climaxes our season of Epiphany by demonstrating the truth of the claims of Advent and Christmas and Easter to come. Jesus is indeed the agent of the realm, and through him, qualities of the future world are already present. Lent, a season of theological reflection, begins this coming Wednesday, Ash Wednesday. The Transfiguration, just as it did in Matthew's community, offers us a vision of the future to sustain us through these sober days of Lent. May it be our vision for Lent. Amen.